Hello and welcome to this interview on Philosophy for All. I am your host, Joshua Yen, and today we're privileged to be joined by Dr. Jensen Suther, a junior fellow in the Harvard Society of Fellows, who is going to talk to us about his recent book on Hegelian Marxism, as well as some of its implications on materialism and contemporary discussions in the world today. So to get started off with this interview, can you tell us a bit more about what drew you to this project?
Absolutely. It was long in the making, about 10 years, I suppose. And the original impetus, I was studying in Frankfurt a number of years ago, back around 2012 on a Fulbright. And I attended a lecture by Robert Pippin on a paper was called Logic as Metaphysics in Hegel's Science of Logic. Something like that, which later grew into his big book on Hegel's Science of Logic that came out around 2019. But this was long before that. And I saw this Pippin give this talk, and I was really sort of floored by it and wanted to understand more about, this idea that in Hegel, logic and metaphysics coincide. I'll say more about that in a minute. And at the same time, I was starting to engage in, I was reading the value form theorists like Moishe Postone and Heinrich and these sorts of people. And in particular, Postone's Time, Labor, and Social Domination, where he offers this very powerful reinterpretation of Marx's Capital, and is really trying to understand how in Marx's project, Marx is not just undertaking a critique of how we distribute wealth under capitalist conditions, but in how we produce it. And Postone grounds this in an analysis of the value form of wealth, or the way that we produce commodities, not for the sake of satisfying use, but for the sake of accumulating capital. So Postone offers this reconstruction of Marx that really emphasizes both capital status as a form of domination, but also as a possible locus of emancipation through the kind of scientific and technological progress that capital accumulation makes possible. So at this particular moment in my trajectory, I was reading the value form people. I was starting to read Pippin and to really get a sense of Hegel's metaphysical project, or how we might understand Hegel's metaphysical project in a new way. Traditionally, the critique of Hegel has been that he's some kind of, and this was Marx's critique of Hegel too, that Hegel is a kind of Neoplatonist who prizes mind over the living activity of human beings, and that Hegel has a sort of cosmic idea of this entity called spirit that's realizing itself through human activity, using individual agents as means to its self-realization. And Pippin is contesting this picture of Hegel's conception of metaphysics and trying to show that Hegel actually means something very different, which has more to do with how we account for the intelligibility of objects and agents, what it means for an object to be an object, and what it means for a subject to be a subject. So at the time, I was really deep in both of these worlds, and the Postone world, the value form world, they have a particular criticism of Hegel that's kind of in proximity to the one that I just canvassed. And on the other side, you have Pippin and this sort of Anglo tradition of Hegel scholarship, Pippin, Robert Brandom, John McDowell, Stephen Holgate, who this group of people in many ways were developing, a very powerful conception of what Hegel's project is about, while more or less on the political side, adopting either a straightforwardly liberal or in some cases a much more conservative, even right Hegelian, as it's sometimes called, view of politics. So essentially, I saw that these two traditions had something to offer each other. That the value form theorists, their project was sort of premised on a distorted understanding of what Hegel's metaphysical project was about. And on the other side, the Hegelians, they had quite a distorted view of what Marx's project was about, and had adopted in my view, a kind of a reformist, and sort of conformist politics on the basis of the rejection of Marx. So I wanted to bring into conversation this revitalized understanding of Hegel's metaphysics and this revitalized understanding of Marx's critique of capital by using the new sort of Hegelian narrative as a way of trying to provide a normative foundation for Marx's critical theory of capitalist modernity, and also to spell out the conception of human agency, rational agency, that I think has to underpin the sort of materialist critique of our modern form of life. And on the other side, I wanted to show that the Marxist tradition, the value form critics, had very powerful critical resources to offer in diagnosing the discontents and pathologies of modern life that the Hegelians didn't really have access to because they had deprived themselves of Marx as a critical resource. So the original aim of the book was to take was really to synthesize Hegel's rational agency theory of freedom and human agency, to synthesize that account in Hegel with the value form critics' critique of capitalist modernity. And I think that you need both of these things together to really do justice to what the Hegelians want to do and to do justice to what the Marxists want to do. So that was the original sort of driving idea behind the project.
That's a very helpful introduction to some of the ideas that we would discuss in this video, and we will be developing on some of these themes as this video goes on. So perhaps to start off with, you've told us a bit about the driving goal of the project, and of course the title of the book is True Materialism. Can you just tell viewers who may be less familiar with the philosophy of Hegel, Marx, and perhaps its context, exactly what is this true materialism that you are trying to look for, and how may this, I suppose, distinguish from previous conceptions of materialism?
Great. Yeah, so Marx uses this phrase, true materialism, in the Theses on Feuerbach, and it crops up in a couple other places, I think. But he wants to differentiate his view of materialism from what he calls like the contemplative materialism of the sort of post-Cartesian 17th and 18th century French traditions, where you have a kind of billiard ball causality model of how the universe operates, and with respect to to giving an account of what history is. I mean, Marx's position is also it's a historical materialism. He's trying to give an account of the causality of history, why things happen in the way that they do. And he's specifically rejecting a mechanical form of materialism, in which some sort of deterministic force modeled on natural law would be sufficient to account for historical change. So when Marx describes what he means by true materialism, he tends to talk about how true materialism starts from the real relationships, the real social relations among human beings or between human beings. And I think for me, the direction that I take this in the project is to show that Marx thinks that, and I should say that not only is Marx, of course, influenced by Hegel, but he's also deeply, deeply influenced by Aristotle. Marx had partly translated De Anima, knew the metaphysics really well, quotes from it all over the place. And Aristotle develops, a very trenchant critique of various forms of materialism that were operative in his moment, especially the materialism of the ancient atomists. And I think that what Marx is after is a recovery of the Aristotelian idea of teleology and purposiveness, where what ultimately makes things the things that they are, what makes something the thing that it is its ergon, its function or purpose. So what makes a knife is its function of cutting, which is what determines what sorts of parts it ought to have, how it's to be made, and ultimately its intelligibility as that thing. And Aristotle, of course, takes this all the way up, not just to describe artifacts, but to make sense of life forms, which is also very, very important to my book, and to human agency. So all living beings have a function, human agents have a function. The function of living beings is their own self-maintenance. Their function is to maintain themselves as the sorts of beings that they are. And in our case, it's to do so, to maintain ourselves, to constitute ourselves in light of right reason, as Aristotle says, to act virtuously in light of reason, and that is our function as human agents. Marx takes this idea of purposiveness, or this very particular conception of function that you get in Aristotle, and I think that what Marx is interested in is the way that if for Aristotle, the form of a thing, which is what individuates its matter and allows its matter to be distinct from the matter of other things, is ultimately its function or purpose, Aristotle's making a claim about how there is no intelligible conception of what matter or materiality is outside of this functional, purposive conception of form. I think that Marx inherits this view and wants to understand as true materialism an account of the material dimension of human life, the material dimension of history, how we reproduce ourselves as living beings, how we metabolize the natural world to keep ourselves going. Marx understands this account of self-reproduction and the reproduction of our matter in light of this notion of function that he's inheriting from Aristotle, with a crucial difference, which is that Aristotle can more or less take for granted. Aristotle's not a historical thinker. Aristotle doesn't really have a conception of freedom, properly speaking. And so Marx, following Hegel, infuses this Aristotelian notion of purpose or function in the human case. In our case, our function isn't just to act virtuously, and it's not just to act, in light of reason, but it's to realize ourselves as free beings and to fulfill the conditions under which we could lead free lives. And that's what flourishing amounts to for beings like us. So I think that Marx's true materialism, how he conceives of true materialism, is he wants to emphasize against the idealists, against Hegel and so on, and Fichte and Kant. He wants to emphasize the material dimension of human life, which concerns the conditions for, literally maintaining our matter, holding ourselves together. And he wants to do so in light of this, functional notion of form, where our function is our drive to realize our freedom. And he does so by tending to the question of historical modes of production. So we have these historical modes of production, which as historical, they change. And he wants to understand those not just in terms of, a set of material or efficient causes which, ultimately underlie and, produce our ideas about the world, our religious conceptions, and so on. I think Marx has a much tighter understanding of the relationship between the question of what counts as material reproduction for us and our self-conception as free beings and our activity of our functional activity of trying to realize our freedom. So that's one aspect of the true materialism claim, where true materialism is it's not opposed to the ideas that we have about ourselves. It's not opposed to reason. It's not opposed to the drive to freedom. But Marx wants to understand our very natural processes by which we reproduce ourselves as living beings as inseparable from our attempt to understand ourselves as free and to mutually regard one another as free beings over the course of this long historical struggle. The second component to the true materialism claim is, if that one isn't already sort of scandalous enough, the second one is maybe a bit more implicit in the book, but I actually want to try to say that the only true materialism is what Hegel calls absolute idealism. And what I mean by that is that the only truly consistent form of materialism, the only form of materialism that's actually genuinely coherent, is a form of idealism to the extent, along Hegelian lines, along the lines that Hegel sort of sketches in his Science of Logic. Any account of materiality that we give, any account of what matter is a conception of how matter ought to be understood. It's not like we have some direct or immediate access to matter, which we can just, sort of describe or immediately apprehend in an act of intuition. Hegel wants to say that any conception of materiality is it's a thought determination. It's a way that we are determining that matter ought to be understood. And to the extent that that's so, what Hegel wants for us to see is that, any kind of empiricism or humanism or atomism, all of these sorts of accounts are failing to take into account the constitutive role played by our own conceptual activity and our own rational activity in determining how we should think about the world and what must be true of the world. So a consistent materialism on Hegel's account, it has to take into consideration its own reliance on a set of concepts and reasons and norms to justify the kind of account of the world that it's trying to give. And this is exactly what I think Hegel's trying to do in the Science of Logic. And I think Marx's conception of a true materialism, and this is one of the claims I want to make in the book, despite Marx's own, protests to the contrary. I think Marx actually needs the sort of account of thinking and the account of the identity between thinking and being that Hegel gives in the Logic for Marx's own conception of materialism to fully work. And that's to say that that Marx's own claim that human history and modes of production are constituted by these purposive processes. They're not just subject to or determined by a set of mechanical causes, but we are agents in our own historical dynamic. That sort of account, that is a philosophical account, and one has to be able to justify it as such. So you have to be able to give an account of how your account is possible. What makes historical materialism a philosophically defensible position? How can we justify an account of human agents as self-determining creatures that metabolize nature in a distinctive way from the rest of plants and animals? And that's exactly what Hegel's trying to do in the Logic, is he's trying to give us an account of how we must make sense of being, what must be true of being, if our account of being is to be consistent and internally coherent. And he builds up from that picture of being, ultimately to an account of how we have to make sense of our own sense-making activity. And that's where we get this distinction in Hegel between, at the very end of the Logic, he gives us an account of life as the first form of subjectivity in nature, the first form of agency in nature, and the first form of sense maker in nature. Because living beings are trying to make sense of their environment. They're trying to distinguish, what's poisonous from what's edible, what's helpful versus what's harmful. They're trying to make these distinctions and to make sense of the world and to divide the world up into different sorts of things, instruments and obstacles. And then Hegel gives us an account of what it means to be the kind of living being that isn't just metabolizing and making these sorts of discriminations, but does so knowingly, does so in light of reasons and justifications for why it's doing what it's doing. And this is how he more or less ends the Logic. And so Hegel is able to derive an account of what it means to be not just a living being and not just a rational agent, but what it means to be the kind of living being that reproduces itself in light of reasons. So Hegel ends up giving us a very compelling, in my view, account of the inseparability of reason and life, or embodiment and reason. And that, I want to say, is the basis for a true materialism, one that can actually justify its conception of what matter is, first of all, that doesn't deny the role that thinking and sense-making plays in determining what matter is, but that's also able to ground its conception of historical agency. And that's exactly what I think Hegel is able to do.
So you talk a lot about Hegel and Marx here, and I suppose we could explore this engagement with Hegel and Marx a bit further. Would you say you're engaging with Hegel and Marx from, I guess, as a book, more of a work of a history of philosophy of sorts, to figure out, well, what was the true relationship between the thoughts of Hegel and Marx? Or is this more of a development from the ideas of Hegel and Marx, and you're perhaps synthesizing these ideas together to generate something which arguably is not found, maybe is found in part in both of these writers, but is something which is new and something which is being which is novel?
Definitely. So Robert Brandom draws a famous and helpful distinction. I mean, it's not his, but he's put it to use in all sorts of very creative ways between de dicto and de re approaches to philosophical work, where, de dicto is concerned with what a philosopher has said, and de re is concerned with the thing itself, with what they should be saying. given what their other commitments are. So it's not just about what's on the page, but given what they are committed to, what other commitments should follow from the commitments that they have. And the approach that I've taken in the book is, I think that it's a bit of both, but I would say that I'm more concerned with providing a de re reconstruction of a possible Hegelian Marxism, meaning that it's not just about what their relationship is. I mean, Marx was clearly influenced by Hegel in very deep ways, and I think that influence continued for all of his mature scientific, as it's often called, work. There's an infamous break thesis propounded by Althusser, and various other people have tried to draw this line in different ways, where Marx was a kind of recovering Hegelian in the 1850s, and had more or less sharply broken with his Hegelian juvenilia from the 1840s by the time he gets to his mature works like Capital. Althusser himself later came to more or less greatly qualify this thesis, because he recognized that, like, philologically it's just not tenable. But I think that the key for me is to say that, yes, Marx misapprehended certain things in Hegel. He took other things from Hegel, and based both on the things that he did take, and also based more generally on the conception of human history, agency, revolution, emancipation, teleology, true materialism, metabolism, all of these sorts of concepts that Marx ends up taking up, that they entail a number of other commitments that Marx is unable to fully justify, and a number of concepts that he would need that he's not really able to entitle himself to. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not only concerned with what Marx does say, but what he should say, given all of his other commitments. And the same goes for Hegel. I'm not just concerned with what Hegel, has to say and what his positions actually were, especially when it comes to his political philosophy and the philosophy of right. But there's a question of, given everything else that Hegel's committed to, and given his own vision of freedom as the self-realization of a certain kind of living being, I would want to say, for example, that Hegel would have to be committed to Marx's critique of capitalist modernity. So that's broadly the approach. It's neither purely de dicto nor purely de re, but it is tending towards a novel synthesis of the views that doesn't just rely on sort of combining different features of each of their thinking, but tries to show how there are aspects of both of them that one has to go beyond in order to do justice to both the thinkers themselves and their relationship to one another.
And that's an interesting point that we can develop upon, because I suppose a lot of people who are engaging with Hegel and Marx who are watching this video might not have really gone through these ideas to their depth, or might come to, I guess, the question of modernism and view it as something which is to a greater or lesser extent somewhat deterministic. They think about things as the end of history, it's teleological, and there's a certain, I suppose, historicist approach to these modernist thinkers, and people might have that conception, whereas I guess your emphasis on talking about freedom would seem to, at least come in stances, but for people watching, may view it as maybe viewed as something which is in contrast to this idea of modernism, or at least this deterministic view of humanity and history. So I was wondering what the role of freedom is in your project, and can you clarify perhaps to those who might have this query a bit more about your writing?
Yeah, so on the question of teleology and history, and the modernism of both Marx and Hegel, and the modernism I'm concerned with more broadly in the book, Yeah, there's a certain view. This is often the view ascribed to Hegel, and that's ascribed to a certain humanist essentialist strand in Marx, where history is conceived as this sort of automated process, by which in Hegel spirit unfolds itself and eventually realizes itself as world spirit, and realizes freedom in this sense, in this sort of automated sense. And for Marx too, the history is the history of class struggle. There's a kind of mechanistic teleological reading of this, where this process unfolds with inexorable causal necessity, and eventuates in communism, with certainty at a certain point in time. And often the criticism of Marx is like, well, if his predictions didn't come true, and like it's clear that the whole theory of history is hogwash because it has no predictive value, and it didn't actually things didn't actually turn out as Marx predicted that they would, and so on. But the logic of purposiveness that I've been talking about, it's not mechanical in the way that the sorts of positions that I've just sketched think that it might be. But this notion of purposiveness, which is originally grounded, as I said earlier, in the activity of living beings, the idea is that the purposiveness in light of which an organism acts and attempts to achieve its end of reproducing itself, very importantly, is subject to a distinction between success and failure, meaning that organisms can fail to do what they're trying to do. They can fall short of their own aims. More complex animals, non-vegetative organisms like animals, they can make mistakes. And in our case, the whole point of giving this theory of rational agency that Hegel is giving is to show that what it means to pursue our purposes and ends, part of that is to be fallible, finite, and subject to the possibility of failing to do what you're trying to do. And what that means is that there's no guarantee of anything. So Hegel's vision of how history has unfolded and the kind of logic of history that he wants to pursue, the claim is not that history had to have happened this way out of some sort of metaphysical or mechanical necessity. It's rather that we can make sense of why history did happen in this way and why it ought to have happened in this way, given what our commitments have been at certain points in time, and what other commitments acted as necessary resolutions to problems or deficiencies in previous forms of social life. So Hegel's view is really concerned with trying to ground our agency in history, and it's perfectly consistent with his theory that we could have stalled out at any point. There was no guarantee that we were going to get to where we are, and there's no reason in principle why a form of life might not, for various reasons, remain within a very defective set of conventions and standards and institutional norms for a very, very long time, and that we can fail at being ourselves, fail at actualizing the full potential of our agency indefinitely. And I think the same is true of Marx. So the point of the kind of historical ideal that you get in Marx, where Marx says things like communism is the riddle of history solved, this is the point at which our form of production would actually be a rational one. in which it's democratically controlled by an associate of free producers, or even Hegel's story about modern civil society and the state as the full embodiment of human striving for freedom. These are points about, in Hegel's case, these are points about how we can make sense of how we got from there to here, and the kinds of irrationalities that, and the kinds of tragedies that human beings have been responsive to in past forms of life, and reconstituting ourselves in sort of new social forms. And this is again, it's a finite, defeasible project that can fail, and there's no certainty at any point. And in Marx's case, I take it that what Marx is saying when he derives communism as, not just some external ideal or transcendent principle that he just happens to, prefer, or that he just thinks is sitting waiting at the end of history. Marx thinks that, like Hegel, that this ideal develops through a process of, yes, class struggle, but also through a process of rational self-correction. As he says in an early letter, that, reason always exists, but not always in a rational form. And that is a way of underscoring that as rational agents, we are always involved in this process of, potential rational self-correction, which again is something that can fail and go wrong, and may happen or not, depending on contingent circumstances. And when it comes to his derivation of communism as the resolution to a contradiction internal to capitalism, and this is Marx's claim, Marx wants to show that communism is not an ideal that we impose from the outside onto capitalism. What he wants to say is that the only way that capitalism can fulfill its own, ideal of social production, say, or the mutual satisfaction of need, or individual freedom, or democratic self-determination, is actually to revolutionize its own standards for production and politics, or political economy altogether. And the thought would be that the communist ought, that what we ought to be struggling for is a communist social form. The claim is not that this will definitely, with certainty, come about at a certain point in the future. The claim is that this is the ideal in light of which we should be orienting our struggles and political activities, and that that puts an enormous onus on the enterprise of justification to other agents as to what they should be doing and what they should be avoiding. And that's where the role of political organization comes in, and questions of solidarity come in, especially in early 20th century Marxist tradition. So it's not about an automated process. And in Marx, this aspect of organization and solidarity and so forth, it remains under theorized. It's just sort of suggested. But later thinkers, especially Lenin and Lukács and Luxemburg, I mean, this is precisely the point that they're really trying to theorize. The whole problem of organization depends on the idea that the Marxist vision of history is not an automated process, but that there is something that must be done. And we have to convince each other that this is what must be done. And that means that there's something we have to do that we can fail to do. So that's the sort of political payoff for this rational agency conception of freedom and of history.
That's quite helpful. It does indeed clarify the nature of freedom. Now, developing upon this a bit further, what do you believe to be the major challenge to modernity? And in some sense, what is the goals that Hegel and Marx I suppose yourself are trying to accomplish through your and their writing, and as well as, well, now that we are, I suppose, intellectually moved somewhat beyond that, and we've seen a few other stages of intellectual development like postmodernity, how does the thoughts that Hegel and Marx apply to the concepts today? Do they face similar challenges that we face today, or do you think that the landscape that we're facing is entirely different?
I don't think that the landscape is entirely different at all. I think that and that it's a major mistake to think that it is, and we see this play out in various ways. I think the key thing to keep in mind, and that my book is trying to also remind us of, is that we remain within a capitalist reality, or even cosmology, if you will. Our whole universe is a capitalist one. And to the extent that that's true, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is capitalism? Regardless of whether it's, mercantilist or neoliberal or commercial or plain liberal, what is it that makes a capitalist form of political economy specifically capitalist? And to the extent that that's the question, and we remain, within the bounds of, capitalism of, some sort, then Marx's analysis is going to continue to have purchase, because basically what he's shown us is what must be true of any form of capitalism. And that has to do with the basic way in which wealth is produced, and the basic antagonism between wage laborers and capitalists. There's a whole spectrum of in-between categories, and we've seen many new social roles, economic roles develop in the past 100 years, or since Marx's time. But the basic analytic point is that whatever else is true, this relationship between capital and labor is a constitutive feature of any capitalist economy, and the extraction of surplus value, its accumulation as capital, and its domination of both workers and capitalists alike. This is an analytic truth of any possible form of capitalist social organization. So in that sense, I think that Marx remains crucial. And for making sense of the ecological crisis, I've got a new piece coming out about this now, sort of criticizing recent tendency in the Marx world, degrowth communism, which is really about this, about how we have to understand what capitalism is to make sense of the ecological crisis. All of the contemporary crises that we're facing, we still require Marx's analytic frame to be able to make sense of them, because we remain within a capitalist social form. So that's one part of the question. Hegel. When it comes to the role that Hegel plays, Hegel is offering an account of what it means to be the rational kind of living agent, period. It's not a historically contingent account. It's even though it arises at a certain point in history, and there are certain historical conditions for its emergence, it's still the case that Hegel's giving us the resources to make sense of the very idea of historical specificity, and to make sense of the very idea of historical context. So without the metaphysical and logical resources that he's giving us, we can't make sense of what it means to be an agent at all, or what history is, or the various ways in which our agency has even been transformed, in the past 100 years. So I think both Hegel and Marx remain absolutely essential in different ways. I mean, you need Marx because we remain within modernity. We remain within modernity conceived as specifically capitalist modernity. And I think those two things go hand in hand. Modernity equals capitalism, and capitalism equals modernity. And Marx is our most profound theorist of that. On the other hand, what Hegel gives us is, he gives us logic as metaphysics. He gives us a conception of how we have to think about the forms of things for them to make sense as the things that they are, and how we have to make sense of the forms of thought for them to make sense as forms of thought. And, you know, to the extent that he's able to show that that his own theory is genuinely self-grounding, and it's able to avoid begging any questions. It's able to avoid presuppositions, and it's able to account for its own possibility as a theory of all reality, but also it's able to account for its status as a theory of mindedness and rationality and human autonomy in general. It remains the most compelling option that we have philosophically for understanding the kinds of beings that we are.
And I suppose we've talked a bit about modernity as capitalist and how Marx is applicable to that, as well as how Hegel's broader structures of thought are applicable to our questions. However, we talk, well, your work focuses a bit on the concept of freedom as well. And can you tell us a bit more about that role of freedom, particularly directed to our contemporary landscape, and whether it calls for a new conception or presentation of freedom within a popular discourse, not only within the academic sphere, but rather within popular society? Do we need to reconceptualize, re-educate ourselves about what freedom is, and how might that look like going forward?
Right. Yeah, great question. I mean, so the first thing to say about the Hegelian conception of freedom is that it more or less dispenses with one of the common distinctions that one often hears in political theory, the Berlin distinction between positive and negative freedom and this sort of thing. I mean, Hegel is coming out of the Kantian thought that freedom is not the freedom to arbitrarily do this or that. It's not just the freedom to pursue your own interests sort of haphazardly or willy-nilly. That freedom for Kant is a matter of self-legislation, by which he means that we as reasoners and as reasoning practical agents give ourselves certain normative standards in light of which we act. We give ourselves principles by which we act and by which we can make sense of the causality of our actions. And most importantly, in Kant, the overriding such principle or norm is the categorical imperative. That you should always act on the maxim that you can will as a universal law, which for Kant means basically, there's some controversies around this, but that we act in a self-consistent way, and that we act in a way that won't undermine our own practical projects. And that means that, given that the maxim must be universally willable, that it also has to be shareable. And the point for Kant is that, part of the account is to show that what it means to be a free being is to be able to go wrong. In the case of laws of nature, things have to happen in the way that they do. There is no room for success or failure in the sphere of mechanical causality. But in the sphere of reason and in the sphere of, the principles that we give to ourselves, we can fail. We can fail to abide by our own internal standards. We can fail to do what the categorical imperative demands of us. And this, again, this is not an external imposition it's not imposed on us from the outside. This is something that we give to ourselves just as actors, because we're trying to realize our ends. And this is the condition under which we can realize our ends. So that makes it an internal principle. It's, in the Aristotelian terms I used at the beginning, it kind of is the function of a rational, efficacious actor in the world. Now, that's one part of the Kantian picture, is that you have to be able to fail if you are to be able to succeed. Success and failure come together as a package. It's a disjunctive relation. But the other part of the Kantian thesis, as he argues in several places, that what it truly means to be free, it's not just to be able to choose what you do, it's to act in accordance with the overriding law or principle of your life. So Kant has a sort of self-realization thesis that to truly be free is to live up to your own essence, to act in light of the principle that, as a practical reasoner, you've given to yourself. And that means that to truly be free is to act in accordance with the categorical imperative, because that's to say that you are actualizing the ends that you set for yourself, and you are actualizing your overriding end as a reasoner. You're according with yourself. You're self-satisfied in a certain way. Now, Hegel takes up this freedom and this conception of freedom and radicalizes it in a certain way, because what Hegel wants to say is not just that sort of in this trans-historical way, as you get in Kant, that everyone for all time is subject to this moral principle that is supposed to be at any point in history accessible to rational agents if they reflect on the conditions of their own agency. They should see how they should be and what they should do. Hegel wants to say that this problem is not so easily solved because we don't have that sort of access. And Hegel basically innovates on Kant in two important ways in the practical sphere. One, Hegel wants to say that there is a social dimension and recognitive dimension, by which I mean the way that we recognize each other sort of horizontally as subjects, that there's a social recognitive dimension to this conception of freedom as self-legislation and self-realization. And he also wants to say that there's a historical dimension. And essentially what that means is that in trying to realize our ends as actors and giving ourselves these the principles in light of which we act, we're always giving ourselves principles that at least purport to be shareable with other agents, are taken to be justifiable just as principles, as reasons. For something to be a reason, it's potentially communicable to another, and it's a possible source of justification for what I do and what I believe. Hegel's saying that this recognitive and social dimension to the freedom problem, it's intrinsic to it. Whereas in Kant, you kind of have this individual sort of monadic relationship to the law. The law is the law of my conscience. Regardless of what others take me to be doing, regardless of how I'm interacting with them, I know what the categorical imperative is demanding of me. Hegel wants to say that there is a crucial social dimension to the problem, meaning that how I'm acting, how I take myself to be acting, that this is not just up to me. It's ultimately a matter of how other subjects recognize me. And whether I'm acting in accordance with the principles I've given myself, I alone can't decide that. There's an irreducible intersubjective dimension to the issue. Now, the historical part of the problem comes in here, because what Hegel wants to say is that we've given ourselves certain principles, and all historical principles that we give to ourselves, they're either enabling to some degree or another, or disabling to some degree or another of this prospect of mutual recognition. So some principles are going to block our ability to recognize each other. They're actually going to curtail the possibility of mutual justification. And if we take capitalism as an example, part of the point is that we are wedded to a conception of individual freedom to how and why we produce. We're wedded to certain conceptions of social roles, how we should do things, that on the one hand, they purport to be universally shareable. We all live in democratic societies governed by, at least in the Western European world, we're all governed by principles that, purport to secure freedom and equality for all, and that, purport to enable us to satisfy our own interests and mutual coordination with one another. But in fact, part of the way that those principles are formulated and the kinds of practices that they license obscure the ways in which they actually undermine that freedom by instituting, for example, a asymmetrical relation between capitalists and laborers that results in domination of one class by another, and the impingement of the freedom of workers, but also in a certain way the freedom of capitalists themselves. So partly what Hegel is trying to say is that through this process of struggling to recognize each other and struggling to justify our practices to one another historically, we gradually learn what sorts of principles would actually be required to ground this sort of mutual recognition that would make individual agency possible and would enable me to accord with my own understanding of myself as, an efficacious, intentional actor in the world. So at the beginning of this comment, I said that this is sort of a rejection of both positive and negative freedom, because it's neither about, freedom from external impingement, but it's also not simply about freedom to do the things that you want to do. It's on the Hegelian conception, there's a question of what sorts of institutional forms would actually allow us to realize our agency, and what sorts of institutional forms would participation in actually count as an aspect of realizing our agency. So it's neither just about doing whatever you want or having the freedom to do X or Y, nor is it about freedom from external interference, but it's about what sorts of ends and institutions would not only enable freedom, but would also themselves count as, that participation in those institutions, that would count as part of what it means to actually be free and to find satisfaction in oneself as an agent and as a rational actor. Now, the way that this bears on our contemporary conception of freedom, I think that part of the point in the Marxist discourse about the struggle for communism, Marx is arguing for a notion of a rational form of association with other agents in which we can consciously and responsibly consider how we're producing, why we're producing what we're producing, and we can make judgments about what we should be producing in a democratic manner, in association with one another, rather than through blind determination by the market. let's say. And Marx wants to say that this isn't just a condition of individual freedom, but that participation in this kind of process, participation in this kind of rational adjudication of how and what we should produce, that in itself is partly what a free life consists in. So there's an ethical dimension to the question of freedom, which has to do with, again, like what form of life wouldn't just enable me to be free, but would, participation in that form of life would actually count as, what it means to satisfy my freedom. That I would find satisfaction in participating in those processes, in helping to decide how we live our lives, in helping to decide, what's to be produced and how. And I think that this conception, this ethical conception of freedom that you get out of Hegel, and that I think Marx is clearly presupposing in his vision of communism, this, as opposed to any, anarchist, rejection of institutional structure, or Foucauldian, sort of skepticism or paranoia about institutions. There are various notions of freedom on the left, and I think that this Hegelian Marxist view of ethical freedom as both an enabling condition of individual freedom and as part of the satisfaction of a human life form, I think it's a far more powerful picture and far more defensible picture of both what it means to be a human agent and what a free form of life would look like, and why something, and it helps us to understand why something like communism is actually desirable.
That's a very good expression of freedom and its application as well as connection to Hegel. But I was wondering whether, by developing this forward, how does the role of class struggle perhaps tie into both this conception of freedom, as well as how does it tie into your broader project? Because of course, class struggle is quite prominent in when people think about Marx, but also, what is the role that class struggle plays here?
Great. Well, I think the key idea is that I would want to see class struggle as an expression of the breakdown or tensions internal to certain historical normative self-conceptions that forms of life have. And this is the side of antagonism. It's the way that sort of as I've been describing, we can't understand our, history purely in terms of these kind of as motivated by the pursuit of base needs, divorced from these ideological questions about what we believe in and what we value. I think that these two things are deeply inseparable. One often hears about a kind of like, and Marx himself, of course, is the originator of this sort of image of like a base superstructure model, where you have a base of economic interests and forms of production and technology, and that the superstructure, which is comprises the ideologies that we have, philosophy, religion, that's just sort of caused by the base, or is a kind of just a reflex of the base. Whereas what I would want to argue is that there's a hylomorphic relationship between these two things, which is a way of saying that, as I was sort of articulating at the beginning of this discussion, that the material of our form of life, our metabolism of nature, our pursuit of the means to the end of satisfying our needs, that it's inseparable from our ideological self-conception, the political domain, how we govern ourselves, that if anything, the causality, it's not an efficient causal relation between a base and a superstructure where the base has primacy, but it's a final causal relation. in which the base is organized and maintained on a superstructural basis, in sort of perfect analogy to the way that the soul and the body go together in the Aristotelian conception, which is to say that the soul is not something added on to the body. It's not some extra material entity. The soul is the form of the organization of the body. It's the principle by which the body holds itself together. And that's how I think we have to construe the relationship between politics and economy, superstructure and base, so on. This relates to the question of class struggle, because rather than seeing class struggle as it's sometimes seen, as just the combat between two opposed forces, in which might makes right. Whoever wins, that just decides. There is no normative authority or normative ideals outside of the sort of standpoint of the victor, and that alone decides what's normative. I mean, in that case, there is no normativity. It obliterates the very idea of normative ideal. And specifically in the case of capitalism, sometimes there's a famous line from Capital Volume 1 where Marx talks about how only where you have two opposed when you have two opposed classes, like the proletariat and the capitalist classes, that only force can decide between them, which is often read as Marx saying that this is not a question of values or normativity, but it's just a question of a hard militant combative struggle. And if the proletariat wins out, then that would make their position the right one, just by fact of them having won out. But that doesn't actually justify the proletariat standpoint or show us why communism is desirable as an ideal. It doesn't help us to understand what Marx clearly wants us to understand, which is that the proletariat struggle for emancipation is a struggle for human emancipation, not just of one class versus another, but he wants us to see that it's only through the proletariat's throwing off of its own chains, its emancipation from its own bondage, that this is a struggle to be supported, and it's a justifiable struggle, precisely because it would constitute the abolition of class struggle altogether, because you would have no more classes, you would have no more class struggle, you would have no more domination of one social group by another, and that's the principle and the idea in light of which we can say that the proletariat struggle for socialism is defensible and justifiable, not just to members of the proletariat class, but ultimately to everyone, even to capitalists. Because what the proletariat is really struggling for is not just their own freedom, they're also struggling for the freedom of capitalists. I mean, that's the sort of counterintuitive move that Marx is making. And to understand Marx's universalism, and to not make it into just a sort of parochial position in which he's arguing for his team, one has to be able to give some account of the universalist aspect of Marx's thought, and the question of the justifiability of the proletariat struggle against capitalism. So class struggle, then, it's the site of antagonism through which the breakdown of a normative order manifests. We can talk about it as the driver of history, but it's one side of a two-sided coin. It is the material motor and the set of forces, through which historical antagonisms are worked out and through which conflict happens. and through which forms of life break down. But it's not just a set of mechanical forces working against each other. It's also a question of normative authority, and a question of which forms of normative authority have broken down, no longer make sense, and now have to be overcome. And there's an expression of that in the struggle itself. And specifically with respect to the capitalist struggle, I think part of Marx's point is that this is a site, the struggle between proletariat and capitalist, this is a site of the breakdown of the modern bourgeois promise of freedom for all, and of equality. And in class struggle, what we're witnessing is, again, not just two mechanical forces coming up against one another, two different preferences for the way the world should be. What we're coming up against is a tension internal to a set of modern ideals themselves. And we're seeing a new model of normative authority emerge out of that struggle, which is what Marx wants to call the normative authority of communism, which is why he says that communism is the riddle of history solved.
That's a very helpful introduction and explanation of class struggle. And one of the things which came to mind during your presentation and your answer was the distinction between a few different, I suppose, hierarchies in society that we witness. Of course, Marx is mostly focused on an economic framework, but I suppose there are other versions of hierarchies and classes of sorts, for example, racial classes and other forms of classes, which do indeed distinguish between, I suppose, people in a society and indeed lead to structures and discrimination and whatnot. So I was wondering whether, I guess, when you're thinking about freedom as a whole, which I suppose is can be seen as a more holistic concept than just purely an economic one, can we see a similar argument made for this abolition of other forms of classes as well, taken beyond a purely economic framework? And would that be a helpful, I suppose, development upon an economic thesis?
Yeah, great. I mean, I think the part of the point for the Marxist tradition is that bourgeois society is already very good in one respect at casting aside, caste-based divisions in society and racial ones. Like, as Marx says, like, all that is solid melts into air. Partly slavery is abolished, not just because it was economically backwards, but also out of the, further attempt to realize the bourgeois revolution, and to actualize the conditions of freedom that are implicit in, the bourgeois ideals of formal freedom and equality. Civil rights and struggle for civil rights in the U.S. is a further attempt to, realize and actualize this ideal of freedom, but it remains deeply contradictory. And partly why it remains contradictory, and this is why I don't think that one can separate the class question from, sort of the race question, is that capitalism always relies on mechanisms of justifying its marginalization of certain groups as means for expropriating surplus value. And there's the Barbara and Karen Fields, Adolph Reed, Walter Ben Michaels. They've done a ton of great work on this issue, where Reed in particular argues, for instance, that that racial ideologies have often been kind of ex post facto justifications for the marginalization and exploitation of certain social groups because of their utility for the capitalist process of expansion and reproduction. Colonial projects have also used this same logic as a basis for justifying imperialist expansion. And so I think that partly we can explain the tendency towards marginalization as intrinsic to the capitalist project, which always has to try to find ways to justify its moves in global space and the things that it's doing. And this, in combination with what Marx diagnoses under the rubric of fetishism, leads to a naturalization of certain abstractions and characteristics and ascribed traits, which help propel this process of marginalization of different communities. So, and the constitution of those communities as communities to be marginalized. So I think that there's two opposed tendencies. I mean, on the one hand, like capitalism is always aiming to both as part of an economic imperative, but also as part of its ideological and political imperative to achieve formal universal equality and freedom, so-called human rights. All of these sorts of things are part and parcel of the project of capitalist modernity. But at the same time, and this is like what someone like Sam Moyn has shown in his work on human rights, those same developments are often masking the real forms of inequality and the real acts of dehumanization that are intrinsic to the process of surplus value extraction, and the need to use human lives as means, and the need to find justification for using human lives as means. So broadly speaking, that's what I would say.
And I suppose a concern there could be to say, well, and do correct me if this concern is somewhat a misinterpretation of that argument, but it could be to say that perhaps these distinctions between, I suppose, groups is something which is more fundamental than an economic structure, and this idea for conflict and the desire for conflict between groups and classes is inseparable from human nature, such that even if, I suppose, communism was to be achieved, or any certain end of history, rather be it capitalist or communist, would to be achieved in its fullness purely as an economic structure, you could potentially see a lingering form of discrimination, or I suppose other hindrances to freedom, to suggest that, I guess someone might suggest that, to view communism as the solution, or materialism as the solution, may in some sense be an incomplete, though of course a comprehensive but not complete picture of human nature. I mean, would that be like a potential response to that, or to the position that you're presenting, or do you think it's kind of misguided?
Well, I don't want to rule out that communism would, of course, raise its own problems and have its own obstacles to overcome, but I think they would be of a completely different nature than what we're facing now, and that's partly because a communist society would be committed to being a fully reflective and transparent one, and a historically self-aware one. But holding that argument to one side, I would say that like race as an ideology, for example, is very much a function of the modern world and this impulse towards marginalization endemic to a capitalist economy. I mean, when race emerges as a full-blown mechanism of self-identification, that really is specific to our modern capitalist moment in many ways. So I think the specific form of marginalization and things like a gender-based division of labor, the identification of certain social groups or ethnicities or racial minorities as suited to certain tasks, and having certain intrinsic traits, that this is part of a logic of fetishism that really comes into its own under specifically capitalist conditions. And to the extent that we overcome those conditions, I see categories like race and gender as withering away, or attaining a a far less powerful organizing role, especially in the case of race, but also gender. As more or less withering away as organizing categories through which we make sense of what social roles people should be assigned to or should be pursuing. They would lose their functionality in a form of ethical life in which human beings are universally recognized first and foremost as rational creatures, not as certain, identities based on contingent traits like, skin color or gender. Or sexual orientation or whatever. So in that sense, I see, the abolition of capitalism and the withering away of a kind of identitarian logic as, going hand in hand, and actualizing our human nature or our rational nature in the deeper sense that we would precisely see each other first and foremost as self-scrutinizing reasoners for whom how we organize ourselves and how we appoint ourselves to certain tasks, is not based on these sort of arbitrary designations, but has more to do with what individuals' interests are and skills they happen to have, and the educational paths that they've followed and their geographical location or whatever. So once you have the predominance of reason and a society that's really based on a process of critical and mutual justification and ruthlessly in all things, then these sorts of contingent identity categories, they'll lose their functional organizing role in social life and wither away, is my view.
Thank you for that that explication and that development. And perhaps wrapping up this interview, we've talked a bit about, of course, the theoretical virtue of your project, as well as some of its applications to I suppose modern constructs and modern contemporary discussions, especially on the political landscape. And I suppose philosophers of history would be able to quite clearly see that, okay, there's some clear challenges and ideas in this book that are worth engaging with and thinking about and wrestling with. However, I guess for the viewer at home who may not be in the side of academia and might be just going through their daily life, they're maybe a worker at school or a teacher or whatever they are, they might be like, well, okay, why should what do these lessons mean for me? How can I apply this philosophy to my own life? What would you say to them about, I guess, your project and its more practical implications to the everyday person, either in their political thought or I suppose just in their lives in general?
Well, what I would hope, and great question, thank you, is that it would open up the sort of full horizon of the world that they're living in, and the how they're not just an atom floating around in the void, but they're living within a certain historical structure, and that there are reasons that they live in the way that they do, profound historical reasons and profound structural reasons. And hopefully it would illuminate both the historical nature of that structure as well as the structure itself, and enable them to make sense of their position in society and help them to see how they're deeply dependent on and in close association with other individuals, even when they think that they're most separate and alone. And in that sense, I hope that it can, in some minimal way, help ignite a spark or, a felt need for solidarity with other people and with other political actors, and to understand what kind of politics actually makes sense. I think so much of the sort of theoretical view of those on the left has been distorted by a kind of hatred of Hegel in particular, and by decades of brutal sort of anti-Hegelian misreadings of Marx. And this isn't just like a scholastic issue, but it rather has to do with one, empowering individuals to see themselves as responsible for their form of life, not just in that they should recycle or watch what they consume, or make sure to go vote every 4 years, but that they're responsible in a deeper sense as part of a collective form of agency, and that they're part of a structure of collective self-determination and self-constitution. And we've not really talked about the second half of the book, which tries to trace how this account that I give in the first half of the book, which is about the Hegel-Marx relation, how we have to understand what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a free being, what it means to be a living being, and what the implications of that are for our critique of capitalism. But the second half of the book tries to trace the implications of this Hegelian Marxist view by examining some of the great works of modernist literature, and to show how these contradictions that I outline in part one are lived out in different institutional contexts and shape those institutions. And these novels, which are deeply popular and widely read and very important to many people, and they speak to people, the hope is that by illuminating these works of literature and the way that they not just reveal these contradictions, but in a way participate in them, and show how we're all participating in them, and show how these narratives are narratives through which we are constituting ourselves as subjects of the capitalist form of life. The aim would be to, help the readers of these novels, which are novels for everyone, see how they're part of this narrative, and how they're helping to, constitute this story that we're living. And the best way to do that is by seeing, possibilities for solidarity with others, given the capitalist structure in which we're all trying to survive, and to see that the only way to effectively oppose and overcome it is through these forms of collective action, in light of a specific conception of what it means to be a person, and a specific conception of what emancipation would actually look like and require of us. So far from being just a sort of scholastic intervention and debates about the relationship between Hegel and Marx and modernist studies or whatever, the deeper hope is that this can shed light on our responsibility for our form of life, and how that's something that falls to everyone, and not just to theoreticians and scholars of Marx. And
Wonderful. Thank you for that summary and that emphasis on its application to our lives. It's something which I think philosophy has to do a lot more of, and I'm very happy to hear that you're very focused on this, because I think a lot of the times philosophy needs to be a bit more outward focused for people to actually realize that there's a lot that can be learned from philosophy, that it's not just some abstract philosophers in an ivory tower, but rather things that can be applied to our everyday dialogues, discussions, and worldviews. So thank you very much for coming onto this channel. Perhaps just to wrap up this interview, can you tell viewers where they can find your work, where they can learn more about what you're doing? Can you direct them to that?
Sure. Yeah. The book True Materialism just came out with Stanford a couple weeks ago. It's available on all the major websites. I'm also working on a second book now called Hegel's Bioaesthetics, which tries to trace the very important role that life plays for Hegel, biological life, in his conception of art, and why art beauty matters, partly because it matters for thinking about our material reproduction as the rational kind of animal. I've got a couple of articles forthcoming, including this piece on degrowth communism in The Point, which should be out within the next few weeks. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. It's great to have this discussion. I hope you've all enjoyed it. And of course, if you want to support the channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And let me know what you want to learn more about in the comments below, and I'll try to arrange those interviews for you. Stay safe, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you next one.